I think we can probably start. We still have participants joining, but I think those who are in the waiting room has joined by now. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for this Florence School of Regulation debate. This is part of the series which we launched last year. Today, we are debating on the stranded of gas infrastructure assets. The format will be as follows. Lee will be moderating the day or the afternoon or the hour and a half. We'll have a couple of presentations. Then there will be a panel with a number of experts that will provide introductory remarks. There will be polls, and then there will be a general discussion among the panelists. If you want to submit questions, especially in the panel debate, please use the Q&A facility of the platform. We will not be monitoring the chat, but we will try to pick up, depending on time, we'll try to pick up some of the most relevant questions, the more general questions, and we will ask them to the panel, to the panelists. So I don't have much more to say. This is recorded. It will be broadcasted on our YouTube, and it will be available after the event. So Lee, I'll pass the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you, and welcome everyone to today's debate. Very pleased to see a large number of people attending, and I think that testifies to the fact that this is a very important issue. It's a novel issue. So I'm very glad that we have speakers and panel members who are prepared to address this very novel issue. I recall a whole discussion of how to deal with stranded assets in the electricity market. We even had special provisions in the first electricity directive to deal with the problem of electricity stranded assets, when, as a result of market liberalization, investors were unable to have the guaranteed return on their costs. That directive actually allowed for partial suspensions of the rules on access at the time, but also provided that the Commission had to take a decision as to whether or not that partial suspension of the third-party access rules would be justified. What happened, in fact, was that most member states compensated the owners for these stranded assets, but they forgot about the state aid rules, and that led to a lot of problems, a lot of litigation at the time. The Commission came up with a methodology as to how to calculate justified state aid compensation. That took several years to get that process up and running. And looking back in time, I think there wasn't a member state that didn't provide some form of compensation. The very large varieties of compensation were provided, and some of them are ongoing to this day, in fact. So perhaps we can, when we get to the issue of stranded gas assets, learn a little bit from the past, the things that went according to plan and the things that did not, and the methods that were used to what extent they might be relevant. Now that in itself is quite a big question, because I think stranding of gas infrastructure presents a lot of novel problems. And we've seen that firsthand here in the Netherlands, where I'm based, where we've been, I think, confronted with the regulator, the ACM, taking one of the early decisions on how to deal with stranded gas infrastructure, given that the industry was faced or is facing something of a perfect storm. We have an over-dimensioned network. We also have declining demand, as in many countries, and declining supply, given that the major gas field in the Netherlands will be phased out by 2023, more or less. So that produced quite a lot of discussion already as to how the tariff methodology should be revised for the coming 5-year period. And that we can touch on, hopefully, in the discussions, to what extent that precedent is of interest elsewhere. So stranding of gas infrastructure is very much a product of declining demand, fueled, if that's the right word, by the energy transition. But there are other issues involved in this stranding, such as removal costs, an issue that was also quite prevalent here in the Netherlands, as large parts of the infrastructure will have to be removed, and potentially conversion costs for the remaining part, whether or not the current tariff structure should also accommodate and then charge on to existing users the cost for future users who might wish to transport blended gas or hydrogen. So it's a complex debate. It involves quite a theoretical discussion, perhaps, of how we structure gas tariffs. It involves always, as with any transition, a question of how to allocate costs. That's a political as well as a legal question. So there are many facets of this debate which we will hopefully touch on today. So I'd like to ask Ilaria Conti from the Florence School to kick off today's session with her presentation. I think Ilaria we know her well, so she's a major gas expert at the Florence School of Regulation.
Many thanks, Lee. Thanks a lot. I will try to share my slides. I hope everyone can see them now. Okay, so thank you very much to you, Lee, and to Alberto for the invitation to this interesting debate. I believe the issue of stranding of gas infrastructure is definitely a very relevant topic at the moment, a topical issue. My task today is basically set the scene, I will try to frame the debate and see how this debate, the specific debate, can be integrated into the wider discussion on energy decarbonization. As you said, Lee, the stranding of gas infrastructure assets presents indeed a lot of novel problems. And I tried with this presentation to provide the big picture of what are the elements that would deserve a discussion in this context. So first of all, definitions, as usual. What are stranded assets? And I didn't have to look too far. I took this definition from the introduction to the topic of this workshop. So stranded assets are physical assets recorded on a corporate balance sheet whose investment value cannot be recouped and must be written off. So in fact, we are talking about assets that no longer provide an economic return prior to the end of their expected economic life. The question is, are we in front of a burden, a cost, or an opportunity that can be exploited to lead to something else? Another relevant, directly related question is definitely what portion of the network could become stranded in this context. We know that we are in the middle of an energy transition. We know that the target is heading towards an integrated energy system, which will be based on, which will require probably a transformation of the infrastructure through which this energy will be carried. But the situation is clearly very foggy at the moment. There are no concrete plans. One of the recent initiatives, a very important one, I believe most of our participants today are familiar with it, is the so-called hydrogen backbone proposal, which has recently been updated just a couple of weeks ago. which entails, it's a big project proposed by a consortium of mainly TSOs in Europe, which propose a European-wide network of hydrogen infrastructure approximately 40,000 kilometers, covering 21 countries by 2040. And about that, according to this proposal, about 70% is based on repurposed existing natural gas pipelines. In our recent response to the consultation by the European Commission on an impact assessment for a hydrogen and gas markets decarbonization package, we stated that the hydrogen backbone has the potential to catalyze the establishment of the decarbonized gas network, but there are also other considerations to be taken into account, such as demand interoperability and efficient delivery of final energy demand. In fact, what we believe would be necessary to adopt is what we can call a no-regret approach based on demand. No regret is, we think, a very efficient expression started in a recent study by Agora and Afri, which aims at identifying what are really the no-regret basins of demand for hydrogen, what sometimes are also called clusters or hydrogen valleys, and start from there to understand what the type of infrastructure that will be needed. So in fact, the first step is really thinking about what is the foreseeable demand, the demand which is no regret, and then thinking of linking these hydrogen demand centers or valleys in the most effective and efficient way. That's the first step we see in the development of future infrastructure. Taking into account also that sometimes because of the limited geographical scope, there can be alternatives to pipeline interconnection, and sometimes, for example, transportation of hydrogen could be more efficient than pipelines. But on the other hand, hydrogen demand is in general still very much uncertain. There is a big debate about this. There are some more optimistic views, some less optimistic views. For example, if we take transport, which is supposed to be one of the big basins for demand of hydrogen, we have to keep in mind that transformation of energy always involves a loss in efficiency. And therefore, even some types of some type of transport which could be fueled by hydrogen may not be the most efficient one compared to other technologies or solutions. There are also additional variables. Electrification. We do not know to what extent electrification will cover for the demand that is currently supplied by gas. We know that, as Lee also reminded us, natural gas will have a diminished role in the future, and the clean molecules that we will see more and more integrated in the system will probably be organized in the form of key corridors rather than running through a vast web of pipeline networks. In this sense, the legislation revised can support the utilization of this existing infrastructure for useful corridors, but should be careful not to create further stranded assets by overcommitting to repurposing infrastructure that eventually might not be used. Also, storage is an element to take into account, because we know that in some countries salt caverns are already existing, but there are some countries that by morphology cannot host salt caverns. Then about biogas and biomethane, we know that the volumes are due to increase, but we do not know to what extent yet. It's very difficult to predict. And also the geography of infrastructure will be related to the connection with LNG terminals. Clearly, particularly when LNG terminals will be repurposed, it would make sense to have them connected directly with the centers of demand through efficient infrastructure. Also, there's a question mark on consumers. We know that they will have an increasing role, a more central role in the future energy system, but we do not know to what extent they will interact. If something similar to what happens in the electricity sector will happen, and we will have to organize reverse flow also in the gas sector. Last but not least, placement of hydrogen installation might be sensitive to the chosen tariff model. So again, in the Agora study, there is a clear picture showing that depending on the type of tariff, the placement of electrolyzers might change for economic reasons. Okay. So in fact, we are in front of an evolving geography of consumption, where we have hydrogen valleys that are obvious demand centers for green hydrogen already now, but we do not know how the infrastructure will evolve. We suggest a gradual approach where we have a parallel development of hydrogen valleys, and repurposing of the existing pipelines connecting demand with consumption. Then at some point, there will be more valleys interconnected. At that point, a backbone infrastructure will be required. And in that case, once the valley, let's say, becomes bigger, that infrastructure should be suitably regulated and operated by regulated entities, hydrogen TSOs. Until that moment, some form of TPAs, like negotiated TPA with the regulatory oversight, might be considered. Final considerations, we can conclude, let's say, this first overview by saying that the key challenge seems to consist in quantifying and identifying which gas infrastructure can or should be repurposed for hydrogen or other use, and also when, at what point in time they will be needed. And this is something that I believe also Dennis will discuss in his intervention. A European-wide approach, for example, cost-benefit analysis, would help mitigate the issue of stranded assets. In this sense, cooperation and coordination across TSOs is key, and the 10-year network development plan can be a very important instrument to help planning the development of infrastructure. Stranded assets, to answer the main question of this online debate, seem to be unavoidable, but it could be that they will impact the energy system only in a very limited extent. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Ilaria, for a very clear explanation of the issues involved. I'd like to then go now to Dennis Hessling, who will give us reflections on how ACER is gearing up to look at the problem. I know it's novel, and maybe at this stage he's able to just sketch out where the main concerns are that might take the debate further forward. So Dennis, thank you very much for your availability today.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, for the invitation, and thank you also for the introduction, because indeed it's quite a new topic, a novel topic, as you said, for us as well. So we don't have any strong views at this moment. In fact, I don't even have slides to share with you, so I will speak based on some speaking notes just to make sure that I can mention the main, let's say, elements that we're thinking about at this stage without taking any firm position. So what I can offer here is to basically structure the debate a bit more, see what focus on what we see as some of the main issues, maybe also invite others in this event to share information or ideas, and also to broaden the issue a bit beyond stranding assets to the question of how to, in the future, use the current methane assets. Because, of course, stranding is one of the possible futures for current natural gas assets, but not the only one. And Ilaria already mentioned the repurposing, which is indeed a different possibility. And at this stage, I think nobody actually knows how much of the assets will end up where. So maybe to start with, I would like to highlight some of the principles that we think are important at this stage, again, without carving anything in stone, but this is based on, let's say, the thinking that we have at this moment, where we think about the main regulatory topics and how we would see them at this point in time. First of all, maybe is to say that when it comes to stranding, stranding is a means. It's not an end in itself. Just like keeping the natural gas infrastructure alive is also not an end in itself. The overall goal, of course, is to reach the decarbonization targets in the most efficient way and as quickly as possible. And then once you go through the process of decarbonizing the European energy system, stranding of natural gas assets may be one of the tools you may need to employ to make sure it happens in the most efficient way. So I think we should keep the broader picture in mind. The overall goal, the policy goal that we're trying to achieve is decarbonization at least cost and as quickly as possible. And then stranding is one of the one of the tools that we need to have in the toolkit, which may be necessary down the road in certain instances. The second point is, if you look at it from the consumer angle, the consumer is normally connected to only one one gas grid, hopefully more than one energy grid. And in the end, the consumer needs to be ensured of continuity of energy supply, which is not necessarily gas supply. And where possible, the consumer should have a choice to choose the option that for this consumer is the best. I'm thinking here in particular not so much about the industrial ones, because they have sufficient means to make a professional choice, but also the household ones, which are connected to gas grids at the moment, at least many of them are in many parts of Europe. And they will need to face a choice over time of converting to, well, maybe electricity, heat pumps, hydrogen maybe. And there, some of the choices may be individual, but many will be collective. So it's important to ensure that it's done in a proper and neutral way, taking all the different interests into account. And just for the anecdote, I'm sure you know this, but in the Netherlands, there's been almost a rallying cry to get houses off the gas grid over the last few years. And so far, it has proven to be a very complex task. They have achieved only a few hundred houses so far to get off the gas grid. That's existing houses, not new ones. And it's quite complex to do this. So it's something that needs to be managed properly to make sure there are new options available before you start discontinuing the current natural gas supply, and to make sure that consumers don't suffer from what is in the end a necessary change. Then when it comes to the assets themselves, I think we should differentiate between those which are regulated, which are mainly on the TSO or DSO side, and those which are, well, either unregulated or maybe semi-regulated, for instance, storages or energy terminals, because they may face a different situation when it comes to the choices to be made and the cost to be paid. For the regulated assets, so for the TSO and DSO assets, normally we would expect the NRAs, the national regulators, to have the final say in terms of which assets would become stranded, where and by when. If assets are semi-regulated or especially unregulated, then of course the situation can be quite different and could also actually vary from case to case and from member state to member state. What I'll focus on more is the regulated part. So let's say typically this would be transmission or distribution assets. One of the important questions, of course, but also one of the sensitive ones, is about the cost of stranded assets. And Lee, you mentioned this already. That's in the end a distributional question, which makes it a political decision. It's not something that is a technical thing you can simply calculate. It's really a question about, okay, in the end, it's a matter of fairness. Who will then bear those costs? And especially if you were to consider financing maybe part of these stranding assets through a special levy, that's of course a political decision, not something for, let's say, technical bodies as NRAs or by extension ACER. And in some cases, the assets, of course, they can be repurposed, as Ilaria already pointed out, for use of hydrogen, natural gas assets, which means that you have to look as a regulator at the regulated assets value. That means that some of the value that is still there in, let's say, the regulatory books, the regulatory accounting base, would need to be preserved once you move it from the asset base of the natural gas undertaking to the hydrogen undertaking. In that process, we don't think it should be either increased or diminished. But of course, you should take into account the depreciation paid for in the past, because of the past users of this natural gas asset already paid part of the bill, maybe even a large part, and that should be taken into account to avoid users in general paying twice for the same asset. The question about how to go through the process and who should propose what, if you think about an investment process, so normally we're used to dealing with, as regulators, with investments into energy networks, whether it's electricity or gas, and normally, let's say the asset owner, the TSO, typically would come forward with a proposal. It's collected then by CEER and CERG in the 10-way NDP that Ilana referred to, the 10-year network development plan, and that kind of gives you a starting process of the whole investment process. If you would apply the similar logic to either repurposing or stranding of natural gas assets, it could cover probably part of the process, because at least for repurposing, would think that the existing asset owners have an incentive to propose this. For stranding, it's maybe more difficult, because for stranding, the current asset owner may face a conflict of interest. They may have an interest to keep the assets alive as long as possible, and simply spread out the cost over a maybe smaller user base, and that may not be in the general interest. So here we have to think about maybe additional incentives, or other governance structures. That's an open question. I don't have an answer in mind here, but we're not sure that let's say the arrangement that we know from adding new investments to the network would also, let's say, work in reverse when it comes to withdrawing assets from the existing network. And then a final point on the principle level, we should not forget that some of these, actually many of these actions could have a cross-border effect, especially if they take place at the transmission level. So both in case you were to decide to repurpose part of a TSO network or to strand part of the network, this could affect the neighbors. And that means you need to take the neighboring interests into account when before you actually take such a decision at national level. If I then try to transform those principles, let's say, into a process, a regulatory process. And again, it's focusing on the regulatory aspects. What could it look like? What kind of process could you set up to make sure this would become a, well, something which takes all the interests into account, is based on main principles, and is applied properly and similarly across the EU? First of all, I think it goes without saying that we need to start with general scenarios which look forward into the use of, well, energy in general, but gas, of course, in particular. And those, of course, has to be clearly linked to the policy goals and to what is called the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans, to make sure those scenarios are in line with the climate goals and how they will be achieved member state by member state. It also means we need to have a broad consultation, because many different parties could be affected in one way or the other by these different scenarios. We need proper regulatory oversight over these scenarios, and we need to avoid any impression of the scenarios being biased towards one or the other particular interest. And that brings us to the ongoing discussion under the 10E regulation. So the regulation for the transmission, the trans-European networks for energy, which is ongoing at the moment, where there's quite some discussion about what the proper well, governance structure would be, who can decide on what, to make sure that this is done in a proper way. But the scenarios as a starting point are really important, and it also means that the importance of getting the governance right and getting trust in this system is really very high. After that, after these general scenarios, we need to get to a more specific level of modeling, because then in the end, you need to translate it into, okay, what does it now mean to the expected or the possible future usage of different assets, with some sensitivities in there, not claiming that anybody can predict the future, but you could look at, let's say, realistic forecasts of the future and what may happen under different scenarios. And that would serve as an input. It will not give you a full answer, but it's an input to help the authority determine which assets would be repurposed or which ones should be stranded, by when. And of course, you would also see that in the modeling, you should be able to see how the volumes would be going down as we move closer to the decarbonization goals. And you may be able to think about things like, okay, what are different threshold values? When does a certain asset, is it no longer valuable to keep it well, keep it functioning, let's say, as a natural gas asset, and when do you need to do something? When is the volume so low and the consumer base so low that you need to take action and actually change something? Of course, for the cross-border aspects, we think there should be an obligation to consult the neighbors and to take the neighboring, well, dependencies and into account. You could think also about the implication of the setup and of these scenarios for the cost of capital. Now, this is a tricky one because, of course, the risk, the reward that you were to give to a regulated entity, let's say the TSO, needs to be aligned to the risk they're taking or they're running. So if the risk increases, you could adapt the cost, but it means that also the risk would be, in that case, on the part of the TSO, in particular when it comes to potential stranding of assets. An important tool that regulators have, and maybe Annegret later on in the panel may want to say a few words about this in the Dutch example, is the depreciation. Depreciation is about how you financially deal with the initial investment of the asset and how you spread those costs over time to be paid back by the users. And here you have two, let's say, main parameters you could play with as a regulator. You could think about the depreciation period, so over how long of a period you would depreciate the initial investment. You could also think about, and ACM is doing that, about depreciation profile to see if you would change the profile, so not having a linear depreciation, but change that over time, because you may expect the user base to go down over time as well, and you want to spread the cost evenly among a similar group of users. The cost of repurposing, or the cost of stranding, if they're there, here we would think that the TSO could make an initial proposal and the NA would approve that or check that, let's say, to see if those costs are efficient or not. And as I said before, I think there's a very important piece of work which is about determining the value of the regulated asset, which should be either repurposed or stranded, because that regulated asset value, the remaining part, the part that hasn't been paid yet through past payments of network users, that is the part that you would have to take out of the regulated asset base from the, let's say, the methane, the natural gas entity. If it's repurposing, you would move it the same value into the hydrogen asset base. If it's stranding, you would actually take it away altogether from the asset base. That's a very specific and detailed amount of work, but it's necessary to do it properly to make sure that costs are only paid for once. And then finally, not to forget, if you are either repurposing or also stranding some of the gas and natural gas assets, you'd also have to think about the remaining users. You would not probably do this in one, let's say, big bang. It would happen over time to bits and pieces of the network, we would imagine. And it means you will still have remaining users of the network to take care of, and that may require some adaptations. And you need to think about who has to pay for those adaptations if actually the reason for either repurposing or stranding some of the assets is maybe from outside of the remaining user base. So you may face some conflict of interest between the new users, let's say, of a hydrogen system and the remaining users of the natural gas system. And we will be in favor of keeping the system of cost reflectivity. I know Jan may have a different view here, but we think it's really important that all the users pay for their own cost and get the right economic signals. I think I will stop here, Lee, and hand back to you. That would be my main contribution at this stage.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much indeed. I think you've put lots of issues on the table. Nothing simple. How do we calculate when assets are efficient? I think that's something that regulators are challenged by in the current conventional system, never mind moving to this multi-purpose framework. And indeed, moving assets out of the RAB will also, I think, generate a great deal of discussion. So I think both our speakers today have given us a lot of food for thought. So I'd like now to move to the panelists who have each 5 minutes to reflect on what has been said and offer their contribution. So may I ask, first of all, Lisa Fischer from E3G to comment. Your organization has already produced quite a lot in this area, which was why caught my attention when I was preparing this, and I thought it would be very interesting to hear from you how you are looking at this debate. Lisa, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the previous inputs, which I found super interesting. Just by means of introduction, E3G is a climate change think tank, not for profit, but we've also been engaging on questions of energy and climate in the European space for over 15 years. And I really found it interesting, and thank you very much, Lee, also for your introduction, that framing of asset stranding, and Dennis put an interesting challenge out there. Stranding, of course, is generally a bad thing, and I think that's the premise of this discussion, but sometimes it can be a means to an end, and it might be in some cases the optimum means to decarbonization and And I just wanted to kind of put that thought out here and think that's something we should come back to. But what I wanted to do is I have 7 points on how we should really address that question, accepting that frame of that we want to avoid asset stranding where possible. I think there's 7 steps. Some of them pick up what Ilaria and Dennis have said, but put them in a slightly different order. I think the background's been set. We will have a much more focused gas infrastructure in the future, also hydrogen infrastructure. And that would already be in the near-term future. We'll have over 30% reduction of gas consumption by 2030. So it's already something real for the next 10 years, and hydrogen won't necessarily have scaled up that much by then. We'll have renovation wave, electrification, and so on, contributing to that. And in fact, one thing before I outline the 7 points, I wanted to highlight as well is we have that clear vision of the EU hydrogen strategy, which is around eventually we will be going towards renewable hydrogen, which actually means conceptually hydrogen infrastructure will become a subsidiary to electricity and how we plan electricity. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind as a background to this conversation and in terms of the trade-off. Now, very quickly to those 7 points, I know I have to be fast. First is really rowing back. Let's not inflate the system any further. I think we know we have the gas infrastructure we need. So the Commission has said that we know we still have the 87 billion euros of infrastructure in the pipeline. So key thing to avoid asset stranding and minimize the cost of asset stranding is actually stop expanding gas infrastructure. Second is avoid being blindsided. It's come up already. We will do a lot of work on building, reducing the consumption of buildings, electrifying industry, and so on. Let's take that into account in how we plan infrastructure. Third, reap the benefits of system integration. That's somehow related, but I wanted to make a more specific point. There's been also some modeling, I think from Artelis, on if we look at planning renewables and hydrogen infrastructure together, actually we can drastically reduce the cost and the need for hydrogen infrastructure. So there is something in how we plan this infrastructure where we can make a significant difference in the overall costs. That's not specifically related to asset stranding, but it's about the overall system cost. Fourth, create value through focus. It's come up in Ilaria's presentation. Hydrogen is a scarce resource. It will be needed specifically in very specific end-use sectors. And through that, we can get the volumes together to really fill pipelines. So let's make sure we focus infrastructure planning on those sectors where we really need hydrogen. And fifth, avoid a new generation of stranded assets. Again, that's already come up a little bit, but especially when we talk about repurposing, there is, of course, vested interest in the process. We need to make sure that the costs where we think that is necessary, we need to invest in repurposing and so on. We need to make sure that the costs for keeping gas infrastructure alive in the meantime and repurposing are only billed to the consumer or taxpayer if that is actually indeed the best option to deliver decarbonization. And if we have an independent way of establishing what some of those really necessary transition costs are. And I think that's the crux that I want to come back to at the end. 6, ensure people pay when they benefit and not when they don't. Dennis has already mentioned that. We need to avoid cross-subsidization as much as possible. That's easiest if we target the end use of hydrogen, because then it's easier to identify who benefits from hydrogen, and hence also easier to make sure those who benefit pay. But the more we blur that in the system, the harder it will get, and that poses a social and legitimacy challenge to this. And last point, create a race to the top. I said it at the beginning, we will already see a lot of changes over the next 10 years. Let's establish incentives for early retirement of gas infrastructure where we can see that can actually reduce the system costs to the end user, because there might be the odd instance where that is already becoming reality over the next 10 years, or where we can avoid costly maintenance or upgrades. And just to conclude, across all of this, bubbles through the question that Dennis has also already mentioned to some extent, is this: so who decides what necessary transition costs are? How do we optimize across the system? I think the TEN is a place to discuss this. We have through the climate law now the proposed independent body that should be looking at climate and the implementation of EU's climate acquis in a way. I think we need to be very mindful that this is connected to how we plan infrastructure and how we construct scenarios around infrastructure, and how we then, as a consequence, allocate the risks and allocate also cost and benefit to this transition. I think I've used up my 5 minutes, so I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You used them up very well. Interesting, I think, to tie the do no harm principle with your 7 points, 7 steps, and ask who benefits and who doesn't. I think that's very important in working out do no harm, to who and what. So thank you. We'll come back, I'm sure, to some of these points, but maybe this is a good point in time to move to the gas infrastructure sector itself, and ask Jan if he would like, on behalf of NSOC, to share some of his views on this debate.
Of course, thank you very much, Lee, and thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. I might start off a little bit provocative then, because I mean, there's a question out there: the stranding of gas infrastructure assets, is that an unavailable consequence of transition? I could start with either answering the question, that my answer would be no, or I would say maybe the question should be put differently, because maybe the question is more how to ensure the most efficient transition of the gas grids and ensuring the lowest possible transition cost for consumers. So, and I think also both Dennis and Ilaria, and yeah, to some extent even Lisa, is also you could say raising this issue maybe as the more relevant question. So, but putting the provocation aside, hopefully we can have a discussion on that afterwards. I think first of all, we do see in the actual numbers that right now gas is actually not decreasing. Gas will play an important role in the next 15-20 years. Natural gas will play an important role in the next 15 to 20 years. And after that, natural gas will be succeeded by hydrogen and biomethane and other low carbon gases. So I think it's too early to call for the funeral. It's about focusing on how to do the transition, and I fully agree there are a lot of regulatory challenges in relation to this transition. So there's absolutely a lot of work to do for legislators and regulators and infrastructure owners as well. In addition to this, and I think maybe also the development in different parts of Europe might be rather different. We have some front runners having a sharp focus on the climate agenda, and I think that will be the case in some countries. We do also have other countries where you're still having coal and lignite, not only in power production, but even in the household heating sector, where the potential of a quick switch from coal, lignite, oil to gas in itself will represent quite a substantial gain in emission reductions, which will you'll simply not be able to do that by electrification or only renewable sources, at least not with the technology and the speed that we see on this now. So in some countries, this will be the situation, and somehow we need to reflect that as well. There is no doubt electrification will prevail and progress substantially in the coming years. There are different takes on how much electricity, how much electrification will be in the future. We are talking about going from plus 20% electricity to maybe plus 50% in itself a huge increase, which I mean, that will happen, and we are, you could say, should adapt to that. At the same time, I think, and that was highlighted, I think, in the Commission's hydrogen strategy, that the molecules, they need to play a role, because otherwise the transition will neither fly. Solar and wind will need a stable backup and supplement, not only for you could say on a day-to-day basis, but also during a season, during a longer period. So I think the key here is not just already now to determine what the future will be in regards to combination of electricity and molecules. There will be a combination, and we'll need to find the right combination there. And again, here maybe the solutions are different in the different parts of Europe. Our scenarios developed together with NSOE, and actually done already done now in a transparent way. We think we have held 9 workshops for the latest, the most recent iteration of TYNDP and the scenarios. We have been proposing from the NSOC side to also to establish a forum, a scenario stakeholder forum to discuss and have these inputs. We are not on, you could say, on the track of suggesting independent panels deciding on this, because I mean, we as the infrastructure owners, not only on for gas but also for electricity, we have a responsibility for the security of supply, for the market functioning, which cannot just be delegated to a panel with a lot of different and relevant viewpoints. But there will be different and relevant viewpoints, and we need to have this multitude of viewpoints to be addressed. So I think the repurposing and the retrofitting of existing gas grids into hydrogen, low carbon gases, blends will be the most important issue regulatorily to address in the coming years. And there will be a lot of to discuss. Dennis, you mentioned this about the mutualization. We are not saying that mutualization is the answer. We're just saying we think that there might be some elements to look into here to make the most efficient transition. The climate, combating the climate consequences is somehow a more overarching issue. It's cannot just be addressed to the individual energy vector. So we are welcoming a discussion. We think, and I see that also in the presentations that we've seen so far, the broadening is not about stranded assets. I think it's a rather marginal issue. Maybe there's a special case in the Netherlands for several reasons. Of course, that need to be addressed. But in general, I would say stranded assets is not the key issue. Repurposing and retrofitting of the assets is a key issue for the regulatory discussion now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think an optimistic future for gas assets, I think, is the message. There's one word I haven't heard mentioned so far in the discussion. That's competition between. But I think we're also going to, in the new world, be moving to much more infrastructural competition, which I think might also impact the regulatory debate going forward. So I'd like to turn the floor now over to Annegret to give us the regulatory perspective.
Yes, thank you, Lee. And in a way, you took out the words out of my mouth, or you were reading my mind, whatever you like. Because indeed, it is important, the factor of to remember that we are working in liberalized markets where we try to establish a competition where possible, of course, not in the natural monopoly grids as such, but the situation is changing. And I think that is also coming back to what you said at the very beginning. One of the difference to the start of the liberalization, where there was a lot of state aid for stranded assets in the electricity sector, I think that had also to do with the fact that at that time, I think no one was really having a modern incentive regulation. And I think that is maybe the first point I want to make, that the problems of the transition that we are facing, and I think we have to recognize, as was said by both Ilaria and also Dennis, that there will be stranded assets. I think we can try to minimize this, and that is in our best interest. But I don't think that we will be able to repurpose 100% of the gas towards hydrogen. I think that would be a bit, let's say, too simple to assume, in which case we would probably not even discuss about this. What we should do is trying to find the best gradual or no regret transition approach, and finding in that way a kind of, let's say, over time, an approach that allows the transition at least costs, which implies costs on the one side, like stranded assets, but trying to minimize them and taking into account, and I think that is also something we had not yet heard, that we are not only talking about costs if we do it right, but that there are also benefits, and in particular, not only decarbonization, not only benefits in the terms of reaching the climate goals, but also benefits in terms of costs or saved costs by using synergies. And with this, I mean, coming back to this important aspect, I think Lisa mentioned it about the system integration. And I think that is something which we have to also look at in terms of savings, in terms of costs. Yeah, so that is an aspect of the equation that ultimately, in the, let's say, as a result, reduces these transition or transaction costs, or whatever you like to call it. This is one aspect that I want to mention additionally. So we are starting from a more efficient cost base, from a more efficient regulatory asset base, which means we are also having less inefficiencies to cover up in this process. Yeah, that's a difference in terms of time that I mentioned. The second thing is we should look at where are the benefits, so where are costs saved by, for example, using and exploiting synergies because of using more the electricity system integration. And the last part then is, of course, trying to find the optimal relationship. And then finally, and that would be then the core of the regulatory, of the regulators, and we have tools there, we have a whole set of tools there as well, using the optimal relation and optimal toolbox and combination of tools that we have. And I tried to explain this briefly in terms of the different tools we have. We mentioned this in a recent CEER paper on stranded assets in the distribution networks. And it is more or less also exactly what ACM actually did in this decision that will enter into force, I think, beginning of next year, if I remember correctly. And let me briefly touch upon the most important things. One was mentioned already, that is a change of the depreciation profile. So basically accelerating depreciation, moving it forward in terms of time, and with a degressive regulation, depreciation rather than a straight line depreciation. So that's one important factor in terms of timing, which then also reflects on who will be paying, which consumer groups, the present consumers or the future consumers. Yeah, so that is something that is important also in terms of fairness, of spreading the costs over time. The same goes along with the second thing that ACM did. They changed from, or will change with this decision, they changed from a real WACC towards a nominal WACC, which basically means the regulatory asset base is no longer indexed, but will be the inflation will be covered immediately, more or less, again by the users that are presently on the network. So second important aspect. Here I would also like to add something that that is not in the decision as far as I understand, but was mentioned by Dennis, that potentially we have to look also on whether there is a higher risk to invest in hydrogen, for example, and which may then also mean a change of the risk premium. Yeah, so that's something again where we have tools to mitigate and to cover the costs that the transition caused in a cost-effective, in a cost-efficient way, and in a cost-causality way. Yeah, it's about also applying the basics, the fundamentals of regulation, of economic regulation, cover the efficient costs and nothing but the efficient cost. So that's these are, I think, the two main issues. And then, of course, we need to look at the last part is also, of course, about the forecast regarding the demand. For example, about hydrogen, to ensure that the transition is done in an efficient way. And then we are not, let's say, moving from one underutilized network to the next one. Yeah, so that is something about having a proper forecast about the development of the demand. And here, I think again we need to base this on the fundaments of regulatory evidence rather than, let's say, wishful thinking. So I think these are the elements, and we need to find a good combination. The key is to factor in, to use all tools and to factor in the different aspects that I mentioned. And last but not least, because we also mentioned this, and of course I'm also speaking here, or speaking more in my capacity as CEER president, and that is about the cross-border aspects and having a proper CBA to assess exactly, assess in an analytical way the costs that will occur across Europe and spread across Europe if neighbors are affected. I think that is something that we mention in our ACER CEER 10E review response. And in this context, I would like to, and with this I come to a close, that it is important here to get the planning right. There should be an integrated planning. This touches again upon the energy system integration of 10 years network development plans. And I think Dennis also mentioned this. And we also clearly advocate for a neutral process by ACER and the NRAs to have to be able to do in a proper way the technical assessment without any bias. We think that because it's not only about infrastructure investment, it is also about non-infrastructure investment, for example, flexibility solutions, and that needs to be assessed with the same methodology in a whole system approach, and that is certainly better done by a neutral body. I don't know, or let's say, personally, I'm convinced we don't need an extra body for this. We have the relevant expertise already with ACER and the NRAs, and that is the best, in our view, to have a neutral assessment, a neutral expert assessment, non-biased, and ensuring that across Europe the costs are allocated in a fair manner, and that only efficient projects will be on the list, for example, and therefore then, of course, also realizing this transition at least costs also for the consumers, because that is our ultimate goal. And with this, I close. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you've put forward the views of the regulators very clearly there. Thank you indeed. I wonder when going forward we'll be looking at efficiency considerations, but maybe also solidarity when we come to the cross-border issues that will confront us in the future too. I'd like to move to the last panelist, Catherine Galano from Frontier Economics, who will comment on some of the examples that we've seen around Europe where regulators have looked at different ways of tackling stranded assets. So, Catherine.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. Indeed, I think we have heard just now from Anne-Grete that there's an expectation that to some extent relative to maybe where we were standing at liberalization, we can make an assumption that those costs that are there to be recovered will have been incurred more efficiently because they will have been incurred under regulatory scrutiny. And I think a number of the regulatory regimes across Europe have also included scrutiny on the decisions to spend on gas infrastructure at an efficient cost, but also to build the right infrastructure. And this has led to, probably contributed to an element of a joint effort already in some places to try and minimize the problem. So before we get into the question, which I'm not well placed at all to answer as to what pipes we will and which pipes we really won't need, there have been a few decisions taken in the spirit of minimizing the problem, which in effect means trying to sort of load more of the costs onto existing natural gas users whilst they're here, and we can maybe pick up in later on in the discussion the extent to which you can accelerate some of your problem by front loading the cost as well. In a number of places we've mentioned already the ACM decision in the Netherlands. So we're going to sort of unpick that a little bit. Basically, at the moment, the decisions that we have seen appear to be all very much embedded in the mechanics of the regulations, as Dennis and Anne-Grete mentioned. In the very vast majority of European countries, the recovery of investment is paced by the depreciation lifetime and the profile of depreciation. And this is probably, the depreciation lifetime is probably where we already have seen most intervention, where if an asset will not be used beyond 2050 and its technical lifetime currently is still another 40 years, then the decision is to try and fully depreciate it before the end of the usage. The UK actually did this as early as the previous regulatory period. So this is a decision that dates back to 8 years ago. It was an acceleration of depreciation, and even a decision that any CBA would have to stop in 2037 at the time. And Belgium as well has recently, the CREG has recently decided that all pipelines will need to be fully depreciated by 2050, which in that case means that if anything that gets built in a manner which has its technical lifetime ticket beyond 2050 needs to be accelerated. And similarly in Austria, the lifetime since 2018 has been set at 30 years, which conveniently takes us to 2048, again, roundabout the current often mentioned deadline of 2050. These interventions basically mean that you accelerate, but you continue to evenly spread recovery between the coming decade and the next decade. And there are other things in the mechanics of the regulation that have been done in order to go further than that. Annegret has mentioned the change in the basis in which you calculate the rate of return. It's a horribly technical matter, but effectively, if you cover inflation via the cost of capital rather than via inflating the value of assets over time, you happen to front load remuneration a little bit, and every little helps, I think. In practice, this is only a lever in those countries where a real rate of return is being set. So in Western Europe, that would cover Great Britain, Ireland, Italy, and France, but there are a number of places where this is not going to be a lever, and the Netherlands has already gone there. And finally, there's the changing the profile of depreciation, either for simplicity or because it matched the profile of usage of gas. In the very vast majority of cases at the moment, the general idea is if an investment is used for 20 years, you recover a 20th of its value in each year for 20 years. But accounting has lots to offer, and in particular, there are profiles according to which you actually recover much more upfront. And what the Dutch regulator did is using one of those methodologies and precisely calibrated how much of the recovery of what is left happens in the next 10 years relative to the following years on the basis of the split of volumes expected to be consumed in the next 5 years relative to the rest of history. And that's a 22 to 78% split. And that, I think, shows how the regulatory toolbox and in all of its mechanics is quite a lot to offer, though obviously there will be the overarching question around to what extent do regulators and operators go down this road together in agreement around how much of the problem you really need to minimize, or whether there was any actual volume risk that was and stranding risk that was signed up to by some of the stakeholders, and therefore that will not be dealt with in this manner. Maybe if I continue to purely draw on the regulatory toolbox, because a number of things have already been said by others, I think in relation to decommissioning and disposal, this is another area where we see some of the existing regulation has some answers to provide. It isn't the case that we don't currently have a rule for what happens when an asset happens to be an asset that can be disposed of, because there are changes that happen in the system. That's always been the case. And not only are there typically already existing rules around how do things leave the RAB. So for instance, in the Netherlands, it used to be the case that assets left the RAB when they just were no longer used, but still had a value, with a little bit of profiling over time. They've now decided that it's a one-shot thing, because this way we deal with it quicker. And each country will have its rule that may need to be adapted, but that exists. Obviously, that doesn't take us to 2050 and all of the stranding, but it can contribute to managing some of the disposals that could happen. Another example that I wanted to mention was provisions for dismantling. And there are some regulatory regimes, the gas storage regulation in France is one of them, where in order to smooth costs of dismantling, provisions are made and covered by regulatory tariffs. They're estimates of costs in relation to costs that are still unsure, and we don't know exactly what will be needed. But if you sort of know you will need to spend something, you can again manage for who pays over time, not who pays by vector, but who pays over time via these types of tools. I think it would be good if we moved to a bit of a discussion. So I will stop there. I think these are the main things that we've seen in the regulatory toolbox. There is nothing in the current toolbox in relation to repurposing, because that is the newest of the new topics, and therefore there is less to bring about there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for introducing some of the national examples into the discussion, and expanding also on the ACM decision, which I think raises lots of interesting issues too. So we've used up quite a bit of time, so I think it might be worthwhile to stop here and go to the polls, and then come back to our participants to reflect on the poll results. So unfortunately, speakers are not allowed to vote. But our listeners, if you would like to look at the first question, if gas demand falls substantially, resulting in excess capacity in pipelines, would it be better to allocate this probably in the shorter term, leaving aside all the repurposing discussions, to taxpayers on fairness grounds? So 3 options: yes or no opinion. So please vote. That's interesting. That's quite evenly divided. Thank you. Well, we'll come back to that. The second poll, please. We'll take them all at once, given the time pressure. This, I think, brings us to the discussion we've had on the regulatory toolbox and what we can do with the tools that we have. If peak usage remains unchanged, but the overall gas volume decrease, could that be reflected in tariff structures so that we should switch to perhaps capacity-based charges? And again, 3 options: yes, no, or no opinion. Okay, so that's a fairly overwhelming yes in the second poll. Right, and finally, the final question actually takes us into the repurposing issue. So how likely is stranding then of the overall infrastructure if conversion can be stimulated? And should the costs then be rolled into the existing tariff structure? So 3 options again. So still, I think the answer there is that stranding is still likely, even if conversion costs could be covered in the existing tariff structure. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like then to use the remaining time left to us to ask our contributors and panelists to reflect then on those results. If those are surprising, or if you think they are fairly predictable given the current state of the debate. So maybe Dennis,
Lee, we also have some questions on the Q&A.
Yes.
If you want also to use this time to
yeah. Okay. Yes, maybe that's also good because we have a number of questions.
I think we have 2 probably, which are the most relevant. To what extent incentives regulation for TSOs is a good tool to allocate asset cost in case of underutilization in the future, whatever this might mean, and the risk of repurposing for hydrogen too soon, i.e. to end up with too much infrastructure for hydrogen and too little infrastructure for gas. That's probably the 2 which seems more appropriate and relevant.
Okay, thank you. So Dennis, maybe going back to you, if you wouldn't mind, if you'd like to reflect on either the 2 questions that Alberto just singled out or the polling results.
Let me pick out 2 points and also in the interest of time to give some reaction from my side. One on the polling results. The second question was about the tariff structures and whether we should move towards more capacity-based tariffs. In fact, capacity-based tariffs are already the norm in gas transmission. If you look at the network code on gas tariff structures, there the basis for charging tariffs is actually capacity. So at least at the TSO level, that is the basis. And we check all the national tariff methodologies as ACER, and we see that indeed in the vast majority of cases, most of the cost, 80% or more, are charged on a capacity-based tariff. So I think by and large, at least for TSO level, we're already there. That would not represent a major change to what we have at the moment in the European gas tariffication. The other point, maybe to pick up on the question, I think that Katja asked it about, could we repurpose too soon for use of hydrogen? That's of course a risk. That's also why it's important, as Annegret was stressing, that the assessment is done in a neutral way, not favoring one particular industry or asset owner or whatever over the other, but making the best possible assessment with a proper CBA and taking all the uncertainties into account. That's also why I think it's important to have legislation in place which allows for what we call flexible regulation, because there's so much uncertainty. You heard it also in the contributions from Lisa and Jan when they spoke about the future of gas. What does it look like? Do we have still a lot of natural gas in there, yes or no? At the moment, nobody knows. What we know is we need to decarbonize as soon as possible. And that will mean that unabated natural gas is on the way out sooner or later. What will replace it? To what extent we'll get molecules in there? We don't know, but we need a legal framework in place that is flexible enough to allow for different futures. And to come to Katja's question then about could we repurpose too soon or maybe too much? That's a risk we have to assess, of course, to balance all the different interests in there. The easy solution is that in some cases, you're actually lucky, like in the Netherlands, we have parallel pipelines. I mean, there's parallel pipelines literally in the ground that you can take one for natural gas for the time being and one repurposing for hydrogen, and both are still available. That's of course not the case across Europe. So in some instances, you will actually have to make a call and say, well, actually, we see that there's sufficient demand in this part of the network to switch now from natural gas to hydrogen. And that will come at a cost. That means that some users who might prefer still natural gas would have to find a different solution. That's why the consultation process, the neutrality of the process, the proper technical assessment is so important to do it properly. But there's no perfect solution. And in some instances, some users may complain about, well, we would have preferred the other approach. That is possible, but that's the fact that you're dealing with the network sector, which has to have one network in most areas, serving a group of customers with different preferences.
Thank you, Dennis. Lisa, would you like to comment?
Yeah, there's a number of things in those questions. I think a lot of it perhaps goes back to the point around we need a mechanism to decide where it makes sense, where stranding is the right option, where repurposing is the right option, and where we just see a decline in volume from electrification or energy efficiency measures. And I am still sort of wondering whether currently we have that capacity to do it, and that is the cornerstone of creating legitimacy in how we calculate tariffs and how we redistribute costs of the transition. And so I think that question, I think we still haven't quite resolved. I know that I appreciate all the contributions on stronger roles of the regulators and so on and so forth, but I guess question is, what are the underlying assumptions we will be using in order to calculate that and in order to make a decision given all the different moving parts. So I think that is perhaps the single biggest challenge for this, but unless we tackle that head on, I think we will always end up running up against the same questions over fairness, or if not fairness, then are we on track for delivering climate? Because we might make optimal decisions in terms of costs and benefits, but not optimal decisions in terms of climate. So I think there is something that we haven't quite resolved yet that would be worth coming back to with a little bit more detail. Also appreciating that Jan's contribution around the future of gas significantly different from my view of what the future of gas is. So again, there is some room for debate, but we can't keep that room open because we can't take decisions on that basis. I think there is something that a vacuum we need to fill for sure.
Maybe that brings me back to a remark, I think it was Dennis that made it at the beginning of his earlier presentation, that this business of stranding, it's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So there has to be some debate, if I follow you, about exactly are we in agreement over what that end is before we look at all the different tools. So can I move to Annegret to ask for her reflections on the discussion and the polling results?
Yes, thank you. Just want to say that indeed it is important to know the underlying assumptions, but I wouldn't, let's say, play out one objective against the other. So we, for example, have proposed that the cost-benefit analysis should also include a sustainability criterion, for example, so that we are also factoring this in. And of course, it is important to have proper, transparent consultation processes. It's a matter of process. But I would say that as I have tried to show, there are regulatory tools, and we also have a regulatory framework, and the 10E currently is being reviewed to be adjusted for this new decarbonization objective that allows us to tackle those questions in a predictable manner, because I also think we should not forget about predictability in this whole. And I would like to pick up one thing that Dennis mentioned, that regulators in a dynamic environment, regulators let's say to react properly to the developments and to set the right incentives for proper future development, need some flexibility and an approach which we as CEER call dynamic regulation, which basically, one example would, for example, be the incentive regulation that a number of NRAs are now introducing, because this then allows you to set the parameters in a way that reflects uncertainties of the development, but also allows to adjust parameters over time, so that you also catch the more dynamic markets that we now see, not only in gas, but in the energy system as a whole, because the transition is a process, and we cannot have the kind of old static regulation or old type of command and control regulation. We need to have this what we call incentive regulation. Maybe last remark. We have also in the ACER CEER paper mentioned for hydrogen, the hydrogen white paper, that we think that not every pipeline, every single hydrogen pipeline that is now fulfilling, or isolated pipelines that is now fulfilling a specific purpose for industry users, for example, should be already regulated. We say it is important that regulation kicks in once it is developed into a natural monopoly grid. But there should be clear criteria when this regulation would kick in. Yeah, so that is something that we take from the telecoms regulation that sets out the criteria of when regulation kicks in. So again, to provide the certainty and the predictability for all operators and market participants. And final remark, we have spoken here mostly about the pricing costing toolbox. It was mentioned that also users should not be cross-subsidizing. So hydrogen users should not, or gas users should not cross-subsidize hydrogen users and the other way around. And therefore, we say it is important that the unbundling regime, once the regulation kicks in, is applied. Yeah, so that we, and this brings us back to the point, ensure that the markets can develop into a competitive market that facilitates also the transition towards new infrastructure because of competitive pressure from user side. We see this, and this is the last remark, on the telecom side that I was just mentioning, where we have a similar development, the transition from the old copper to fiber networks, to faster broadband networks. And all the questions we are discussing here, they are there discussed as well. And the question on how to best regulate to make this change happen in an efficient manner and in a fair manner for all users.
Thank you very much. We're beginning to run out of time, so I would like to ask both Catherine and Jan very quickly to say if there's one, maybe to reflect on whether if you could advise regulators, if there's one tool in their toolbox that they must have, what would it be? And I hope you can both answer that question very quickly. And I apologize for constraining you with time. Catherine, have you a suggestion?
I think if I were to look at what we have already and where a gap might be, I might focus on the CVA. There will be loads of other questions, but I think that we increasingly talk of the mother of all CVAs. You can have loads of CVAs for how you take small decisions everywhere, but you probably need a bit of a sort of a whole systems cost benefits analysis tool with widely shared understanding of how it should cover. And I would like to add one consideration in there, in particular, relation to the specific question of repurposing, of including dismantling costs in those CVAs. And I think one of the tools we could build on to try and go there is where we've had project-specific cost benefits analysis methodologies derived and reference costs derived, where that was helpful in order to try and make the debate a little bit more objective, because it is a bit of a mammoth task that needs to be taken, that will have cross-border repercussions, and it cannot be the case that everyone develops their own CVA framework bottom-up, pipeline by pipeline, in order to deal with this question, and the rest can follow.
Thank you very much. And very quickly now, turning to Jan to have the last word here.
Thank you very much. Just a very few remarks here. First of all, I would like to remind everyone that we are not doing central planning or in this sector. We are trying to create a framework for the market players and for the competition actually to work and to deliver the solutions on climate, on competition, on security of supply. And we need to keep that in mind. We are not doing central planning. We should look for how do we create a framework. It's very, I think the discussion today has been very good, and also showing the character of the debate goes more in the direction of how do we now repurpose and make the right infrastructure and energy infrastructure for the future in a decarbonized environment. How do we make that, rather than to focus on the stranded assets? I think that has been very positive. In relation to the how do we then do the scenarios and how the future look like, I fully agree that we should do this in as neutral way as possible. On the other hand, we do also need to reflect that there are companies who have the responsibility and actually have the responsibility for creating security of supply, have the responsibility for making the market functioning, and should also, and that is a new element which is now coming stronger into the European regulation, should have the responsibility to provide the right framework for the climate transition. And I mean, we have been talking about this for many years, but it is first now I see the concrete developments that we're actually getting this into the obligations of those involved. So my advice to the regulators: work together with the companies actually out there, take in both the practical and the theoretical considerations, and you could say make sure that these things are working in practice, not only on paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So again, an optimistic note there to, I think, end our discussion today, which I hope you will all agree has been very rich. Certainly, there are lots of questions on the table, urgent questions, in order to evolve a regulatory system that can help these complex decisions being made in an efficient and urgent way. So I hope that we've whetted your appetite today. I think this will be a discussion we'll come back to. It has many facets. So with that, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the participants today, and I'd like to thank my colleagues in Florence for making the session possible, and to our audience for staying with us and also feeding into the Q&A some very interesting questions. So Alberto, turning to you, a final word. We have 1 minute left, I think, so.
Yeah, but don't worry, I won't say much. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I would like to thank all of those who have contributed to it. And I think, you know, a number of issues have emerged which will require further attention. I have in my list, just to mention the obvious ones, you know, the repurposing, and repurposing and stranding are two sides of the same coins. You know, whatever cannot be repurposed and won't be used and has to end up somewhere, and stranding is one possibility. So these are topics that with Lee we will reflect for further debates in the future, possibly after the summer or before we have other topics. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Chiara. Without her, you know, nothing of this would happen. And we look forward. Well, every Wednesday, as you know, there are events at the Florence School of Regulation Online, a part of this series. We are back together in a month's time, in 4 weeks' time. So we hope to see you then, and there will be an announcement coming in due course. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Lee, for moderating very effectively. Thanks, Chiara.